to this week's Money Metals podcast, helping gold and silver investors during these turbulent times. Now, this week's market wrap with commentary and analysis from Money Metals Exchange, the company named Best Overall Precious Metals Dealer by Investopedia.
Welcome to this week's Market Wrap podcast. I'm Mike Gleason. Well, as anyone who listens to our weekly Market Wrap podcast or the Money Metals Midweek Memo podcast knows, the Federal Reserve and its policies are often key topics on our programs. The Fed, unfortunately, has significant influence on our money, on the markets, and our economy as a whole. But why is that? Why does this entity have so much power? Well, today we have the incredible honor of talking to the man who wrote a book on the origins of the Fed, one you may have heard of, titled The Creature from Jekyll Island. That author, G. Edward Griffin, is our interview guest this week, and you will not want to miss the incredible and sketchy story of how the Federal Reserve came to be over a century ago. So be sure to stick around for a must-hear interview with renowned author and champion of liberty, G. Edward Griffin, coming up after this week's market update. Given all the attention gold in particular has received in recent months, as well as large gains in the dollar price of both gold and silver, you'd think the average investor would finally be getting involved in the market in a big way. In reality, though, we're seeing only a tiny uptick in U.S. retail market demand. The demand driving the metals price gains continues to come from abroad. Sadly, the experts that guide the American mainstream are still steeped in conventional thinking and therefore poo-poo gold. As a result, an allocation to physical precious metals, even via ETFs, is still unusual, despite the fact that we're nearly 25 years in to a long-term uptrend. Meanwhile, our friend Brian London of the renowned gold newsletter just wrote, quote, "The tremendous rally we've seen in gold over the past 2 months and even over the past year is telling us something about the future, and that something is likely some combination of easier money and higher inflation." Meanwhile, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said this week that no one should be worried about a recession. During his press conference following the March FOMC meeting, Powell called the economy strong overall, and he brushed aside rising concerns about a recession, saying, quote, "We don't make such a forecast." Not everyone is convinced. Recession worries have swelled over the last month as the trade war kicked off in earnest. The Atlanta Fed's GDP Now forecast plunged from a 2.3% growth rate in late February to minus 2.8% within a matter of weeks. It is currently at minus 1.8%. And despite Powell's rosy talking points, the Fed lowered its growth forecast to a 1.7% pace this year, down 0.4 percentage points from what it projected in December. Granted, that's nowhere near recession territory, but it does indicate the central bankers aren't quite as optimistic as Powell made it sound. But the Fed has a long track record of painting overly optimistic pictures of the economy, especially in the years leading up to the Great Recession and 2008 financial crisis, or more recently, when Powell claimed inflation was only, quote, transitory. The saying goes, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Well, we can easily hear echoes of 2008 in the trajectory of today's economy. We had a massive injection of easy money into the market, just like after the dot-com bubble burst. Powell had to raise rates to keep a lid on price inflation, just like Ben Bernanke did in the early 2000s. The Fed started easing monetary policy, promising a soft landing, just like Bernanke promised in 2007. And we have the same kinds of people telling us today there's nothing to worry about. In other news, Money Metals has a few specials going on right now. In particular, check out our discounted pricing on $20 Liberty Gold coins, half-gram gold bars, and various silver coins. At the same time, some folks may feel it's time to take some profits and or need funds for another purpose. If so, don't forget Money Metals is also an excellent place to sell your gold and silver. This can be done through any product page at moneymetals.com or by calling 1-800-800-1865. Well, before we get to this week's incredible interview, let's check out the weekly price action. Gold is pulling back here today and is off its highs from earlier in the week. The yellow metal currently checks in at $3,026 an ounce, up just 1% now for the week. Assuming it staves off a late-day collapse, gold is poised to end the week in positive territory for the 11th time now in the last 12 weeks. Turning to the white metals, silver is off 80 cents, or about 2.4% on the week, to trade at $33.19 an ounce. Platinum is back under $1,000 after popping above it last week and currently trades at $993, down 1.9% for the week. And finally, palladium is off 1.2% to come in at $988 an ounce as of this Friday midday recording. Well, now, without further delay, here's this week's exclusive interview with a Liberty Movement icon.
Greetings, I'm Mike Meharry, a reporter and analyst here at Money Metals, and I'm very excited to be joined today by G. Edward Griffin. For this audience, he's probably best known for his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, but he has actually written a large number of books on a wide range of subjects, from health and nutrition to the location of the Noah's Ark. So quite a prolific body of work. He's also worked in film and produced a number of film documentaries, and is still out there doing stuff. And very excited to have you on the show. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing well, Mike, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, absolutely. It's really exciting to talk to you. I think that anybody who is interested in what's going on with the economy and whatnot has to be interested in the Federal Reserve, because it's such a linchpin to so much that's going on. And your book was so groundbreaking at the time in kind of exposing the origins of that august institution. And I kind of like to start just, I don't want to assume that everybody in the audience has read the book, and I'm going to guess that a lot of people may not even be familiar at all with the story of how the Fed kind of emerged. So can you just, in kind of a relatively concise way, kind of just sum up for somebody who doesn't know anything about the Fed, kind of explain, how did this central bank come to be?
Well, yeah, that's the impossible task to boil it down to.
It really is, because there's so much. But
there's so much. But the highlight is, first of all, I think people, if they're not familiar with the Fed at all, they probably don't even know what it is.
That's fair.
And I was in that position, by the way, at one time. I made it all the way into young adulthood, had been married, had a couple of kids before I ever even cared what the Federal Reserve was.
Right.
But I had assumed, as most people do, that it was an agency of the federal government, mm-hmm. and that it was somehow involved with regulating the banks and the money system, all for my benefit,
Right.
How far from the truth that was.
Indeed.
But so that's what I thought, and most people think it has something like that in its character. But in essence, the truth is quite the opposite. First of all, the Federal Reserve System is not a government agency. It is a private institution that was chartered by the federal government. It created the Federal Reserve Act back in 1913. Just like states charter corporations in their states, the federal government can charter also, and this is one of those, where they created the Federal Reserve Corporation, literally, and it's a private institution, but it was created by the federal government,
right,
and authenticated by it. But it is, in essence, an association, like a labor union or something like that, mm-hmm. of bankers, of banking systems, companies. And the correct word for it is a cartel. It's a cartel of banks. And in that sense, it's kind of shocking to put it in the context of the right word, because it means that, in essence, it's no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel.
Right.
It happens to be a banking cartel.
Yeah, a money cartel.
A money cartel, and privately owned. And it gets even more weird when you assume that this cartel would be subject to oversight and regulations and control by the federal government that created it. And here again is another shocker, at least it was for me, and that it is quite not that way. In fact, it's actually more the other way around.
Yeah.
It started off just being an institution that was chartered, independent. The government had no power over it whatsoever except to abolish it. It was written into the charter that the federal government would have no control over its policies, although it would go to great length to make it appear that it was a government agency and that the electorate had somehow some magical control over it through their elected representatives, when in fact it did not. So that's where you start with that kind of an assumption, and you realize, well, wait a minute, we need to know more about this puppy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially since when it was created, they had convinced these ignorant politicians in Washington to give it the power to create the nation's money supply. Mm. Now, that is a mind-boggler right by itself, because that traditionally is a power limited to the sovereign, which means the government,
right,
the source of all authority. And but in this case, the sovereign, meaning the federal government, delegated that power to this private cartel. And it was absolutely an amazing, phenomenal move that has had profound consequences for the American people and largely throughout the world as well.
Yeah.
Because it has developed, and let's cut to the chase, it has developed to become what I consider to be a criminal organization. Because what it's doing is not in the interest of the American people. And it's doing what cartels always do, and that is to further the benefit to the members of the cartel, period, hard close, period.
Right.
And in so doing, it has legally plundered the American people. And so that's the short version.
Yeah.
But no, there's a lot of gaps to be filled in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. But you make some really good points. And I think, I'm sure that a lot of people aren't even aware that the whole idea that the government can charter a corporation is questionable from a constitutional standpoint. I mean, that was a huge debate early in the Republic. In fact, arguably one of the first big debates was Hamilton wanted to create this national bank. And people like Madison and Jefferson were like, no, there's no power in the Constitution for you to charter a corporation, much less a bank. And yet here we are with this, I think you described it very accurate, this cartel that effectively manipulates and manages and monopolizes our money, which is crazy. Now, the whole thing was created in secret, right? This isn't like something, that happened on the news and everybody was aware of it. It was pretty shady in its origins, right?
Well, that's very right. Yeah, that's the reason I called my book The Creature from Jekyll Island, because Jekyll Island is a real island off the coast of Georgia. Mm-hmm. And it was a resort island in those days. Well, it still is, yeah. But it was completely privately owned in those days by a small handful of what we would call billionaires today, the elitists, right. The Rockefellers, and the big industrial powers had their winter cottages in Jekyll Island because they were pretty well headquartered in New York. Well, it gets cold in New York in the wintertime. So these guys always split south to go down to Georgia, and they had mansions down there and a very large and beautiful clubhouse. I called the Jekyll Island Clubhouse. They were all members of it. It was a private island. And so that's where they went to put together this organization, this cartel called the Federal Reserve, primarily so they would not be under the watchful eye of newspaper reporters or other politicians or just curiosities seekers. So it was highly, highly secret. I think probably very few wars of history have ever been concocted under greater conditions of secrecy than this one. They even went to the extent of they all got on board Senator Aldrich's railroad car, let's put it that way, in New Jersey. And so they all had to meet at the New Jersey Railroad station. And they were given orders that when they got to the station, they would not come in groups or together, not be seen together, to come separately, and not to talk to each other if they should happen to bump into each other, because they didn't want to call attention to themselves. And because they knew that newspaper reporters always would hang out at the railroad station to get a quick picture or a statement from some celebrity moving in and out of New York. And they were further instructed that when they got on board Senator Aldrich's private railroad car, that when they spoke to each other, they were not to address each other by their full names, to use first names only. And in one case, there two of them just adopted code names entirely. And there's a lot of things like that. And you say, why is that? Well, it's obvious what it was, because later on, a couple of those people there actually were prompted to write about it and boast about it. Yeah. And of course, the information also found its way into the biographies of some of these very powerful people. And so it's easy, if you want to do a little research, to get an eyewitness account of how much secrecy and planning went into this meeting. And they explained it very well. They said very clearly that if the word had gotten out that this particular group of top financiers, the heads of the greatest banks in America, were getting together in a private meeting and holding up for 10 days or so, that they'd start asking questions, what's going on?
Right.
And they did not want that at all. So, and one of them carried a shotgun in a big black case, just in case he would be stopped by a reporter. He was prepared to say, well, I'm just going on a duck hunting trip. And in that case, that was Paul Warburg, by the way. And the funny thing is, we find out from his biographers that he never fired a gun in his life.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
He borrowed that just for camouflage.
A prop, right?
A prop, yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's funny to me because when I hear something like that, a bunch of people, high-powered, heavily connected, political people, are going to this length to do something in secret, my radar goes off, right? I'm thinking, this is not, there's something shady going on. This is something I need to look. And yet when you tell the story, so many people are like, oh, no, it was no big deal. Why do you think it is that people have such a hard time grasping that this is at least sketchy at best and probably dangerous in reality? Why are people resistant to kind of seeing what to me is clearly a cautionary tale?
Well, I've given that a lot of thought, and I have come to the conclusion that it's a very simple answer, and that is because if they recognize that there's skullduggery going on, then they have a responsibility to find out what it is and to do something about it, and it kind of disrupts their normal life.
Yeah.
They just assume everything is fine, leave me alone, la 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 la, you know.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's still funny because the people are going to come after you. Oh, this guy, he's some kind of wackadoo, you know. And again, it seems so obvious to me. When you were doing research for the book, and people should know, there was actually, the film came before the book, right? You actually did a documentary film that came out the year before the book. Is that right?
Let me think. I never really produced a documentary film on that. I've had some speeches. My lectures have been recorded.
Yeah.
And some of them have had images plastered over my.
Yeah, maybe that's what it's. I got that from. I can't remember what source I saw that. Regardless, you mentioned the fact that as a young man, you don't know anything about a central bank, and who really cares? When you started digging in and doing the research, what is something that surprised you the most? So you were like, wow, this even, because obviously you had some inkling that there was kind of shady, but what's something that really surprised you as you were doing your research?
Well, there were a lot of surprises. Let me think of the biggest surprise. Well, like you, I'll parrot pretty much what you said. The thing that attracted my attention most was the secrecy surrounding this meeting. Mm-hmm. What I said a moment ago is just a short version of all of it. There was a tremendous amount of deception going on, not only to conceal the fact of the meeting, but to prevent any information about the meeting taking place from being made public for quite a while thereafter. It was obvious that there was something big going on, and that was the shocker to me, as you just very well described. I always assumed that if people do something in secret, there's something to hide.
Right,
and
exactly.
So I wanted to find out what were these guys trying to hide, and well, of course, it was so big you can't imagine it because it's too big to see, really. And that is the fact that they were taking over control of the federal government of the United States through the monetary system.
Yeah.
Well, naturally, you don't want to tell everybody, "Hey, everybody, look what we're doing. By the time we're through with this job, we're going to own the government because
Right.
we'll have control of the money system." Yeah.
Yeah, it's.
And let me add one more thing.
Yeah.
One more thing. It's sort of an appendage to that. After the period of time, it took maybe, 30, 40, 50 years after that, this thing evolved. It started at relatively harmless proportions. Paul Warburg had said that they had to make concessions for the original proposal because there was some opposition in Congress, and Warburg said, "Hey, give them their concessions." And the response was, "Well, we can't do that. That's going to interfere with our ability to do what we want to do." And he said, "Come on, guys, relax. Our job is to get the bill passed. We can fix it up later." That was his exact phrase in writing.
Yeah.
Well, so they made it relatively harmless in the beginning, but since that time, the Federal Reserve Act has been amended over 100 times, and it has become something that was far more gruesome and frightening than I think even they imagined it would be possible to do.
Yeah.
So you follow that trail all the way to today, and you come to the most startling of all things for me, and that is to realize that instead of the federal government controlling the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve System controls the government. And it's really that way, although you'd never guess it by reading your newspaper.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a shocker.
Yeah. Well, I understand enough about monetary policy to understand and recognize that if it weren't for the mechanizations of the Federal Reserve, the federal government wouldn't be able to borrow and spend money to the extent that it does. I mean, isn't the Fed, in a sense, an enabler of big government, right? I mean, you can't run wars and have a huge welfare state without a lot of borrowing and spending, and you can't do that without money creation, and the Fed does that in spades.
Well, that's right. Yeah, you have to fund all this thing, and the population will never put up with that kind of taxation. So you have to disguise it as inflation. And that's where the central bank comes in.
Right.
Of course, theoretically, you can do that without a central bank. You could just nationalize the Federal Reserve System.
Right.
And some people advocate that. I don't, because that's just shifting the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. It's not who creates money out of nothing. It's the fact that somebody creates it out of nothing.
Hey, yeah, that's the problem.
That's the problem. And I don't care whether it's those big bad bankers or those nice trustworthy politicians.
Right.
It's going to come out the same way.
Right, exactly. I think the fact that there is a central bank involved in it, though, it does kind of, I think it makes it easier for them to hide what they're doing in some ways.
Much more, because it's more complicated.
Yeah.
Because it's not the government. Look, it's like it's an agency. It's independent.
Right.
And it seems like there's, give and take on this, and somebody's controlling it and watching it, and all that facade, which is not true.
Yeah.
It's window dressing.
Right. Every time I hear Jerome Powell talk about a Fed independence, I just kind of, I simultaneously snicker and cringe.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the book that when it came out, and again, it came out in the early 90s, is there anything in there that people kind of scoffed at you about, that you look at it now and it's so obvious that you feel just completely vindicated because nobody can deny it anymore?
Yes, there is. It's there are two things, and they're relatively small, but to me, they're big.
Yeah.
I mean, this is my baby. When I did this book, of course, I was and still am the first to acknowledge that I'm the last person in the world qualified to write a book like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I had no no training in banking or money, no interest in it. I thought that was all taken care of by the politicians and so forth. So I had to start from ground zero. And as I'm going through this thing and learning as I dig deeper and deeper that the topic is much bigger than I thought it was, until finally I almost gave up. I thought, this is too big for me. Little old me, I don't understand this stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And, but I continued to plunge through. I thought, boy, when this book is finally published, I'm going to be slaughtered by the real, the real knowledgeable people are going to pick this apart and expose me as a fraud that I am.
Yeah, it's the old imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah. So I was scared to death when the book finally hit the streets, and I was on a book tour, and I was waiting for the axe to fall, and I got a call from a local radio station in some little town in the East Coast, and asked if I would come into the studio and be interviewed. Well, sure, that's why I was out there on the book tour.
Yeah.
But when I got there was another guy sitting there at the table, and I was introduced to Professor Egghead, or whatever his name was, from the local university, and he was a professor of money and banking.
Yeah.
I thought, this is my execution. I'm going to be publicly taken apart and destroyed. And so, the on the air sign lit up, and the moderator or the host started with me. He said, "Well, Mr. Griffin, we have Professor so and so here, and we want to hear the give and take between you people on this topic. Let's start with you. What is your message?" Well, I knew I didn't have a lot of time.
Right.
So somehow I cobbled together probably about a 3 or 4 minute summary of the reasons that I was opposed to the Fed, such as that, it financed wars, it destroyed the purchasing power of the working man, I had these major points. I went through all of them, and I said, those are the reasons that I'm opposed to the Fed. Now, no explanation as to how that happened. It was just sort of a summary.
Sure.
And so the host turned to the professor. He said, "Well, what is your response to that?" And I'll never forget it. I'm sitting there all shriveled up, waiting for the axe to come. And there was a long pause. And he said, "Well, what he says is true, but we're living well, aren't we?"
Oh, wow.
That was his rebuttal.
Yeah. And
I couldn't believe it.
You thought, I've got this.
I thought, is that it? Is that it? He admitted that everything I said was true.
Yeah.
And I have never had. Now, the other thing was, some other professor early in the game sent me a letter and said that I had the wrong Tsar on page 222 in the book. It was not Tsar Nicholas, it was Tsar Alexander or something. It was not the third, it was the fourth or something.
Right.
I thought, how could I make such a big mistake as that? Okay, now, to answer your question, those are the two things that even come close to being a confrontation of what I have done.
Yeah.
And that adds up to zero.
Right.
I'm absolutely amazed. I'm just amazed. Because that is a very profound and complicated topic.
Absolutely. What was your
I think the only reason I survived is because I refused to get into the complications.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, let's stick with the obvious overriding facts.
Yeah.
And nobody cares about how many votes it takes to get, such and such as through the board of directors. And,
right.
And what they want to know, this is a whodunit. I wrote it like a whodunit.
Yeah.
I described what the crime was, what the weapon was, and what they did with the body.
That's fantastic. What was your background going into the project?
Well, again, I'm probably the least qualified because my background was in theater and radio and television. I'd worked my way through college and as a radio announcer at the university. I had a job with WWJ-TV in Detroit as an assistant director, and I wanted to go to Hollywood and become the next Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah.
And of course, that didn't work out. That was my background, and so by that time, I had a wife and a couple of kids to support. And I thought, I better get a real job.
Right.
So I went into the corporate world, and I was in the insurance business, in group insurance, writing insurance policies for corporations and their employees, until I discovered what was really going on in the world. And my crusader gene began to vibrate, and quit my job, and then that was a whole different story. So that was my background.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me, because as somebody who is interested in theater and communication, you know how to tell a story, and I think that's a problem with so many people that to try to tackle these kind of political, finance. It's boring, right? But if you can tell it as a story, as you very wonderfully put it, you made it into a whodunit. That grabs people's attention, and anybody can do research. Not anybody, but if you're a relatively intelligent person, you can do the research. So that makes sense to me, because you have that storytelling ability, and that definitely comes through in your writing, and even in talking to you. You have that ability to communicate, and I think that's so lacking, especially when it comes to the world of finance and money and politics. It's so dry and boring, and so it's refreshing to get it as a story, because the facts are there, but people can relate to it and kind of absorb it.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it is. It's a whodunit, and we know who did it, and now we know how they did it, and the only question is, are we going to bring them to justice for it or not?
Yeah. So here's a question, kind of looking at the Fed as it is today. We've seen more and more interventions and deeper and more profound interventions in the economy with each crisis. So we've got the boom bust that you can kind of go back all the way to, the .com, and then the Fed intervenes and they cut interest rates and they create all this money, and then creates a boom, and then we have another bust. And the pandemic was just absolutely insane. You just consider they created $5 trillion just in quantitative easing. Do you think there's going to come a point where these guys are going to lose control of this, and they're no longer going to be able to keep the monster that they've leashed?
Let me think how I answer that question accurately. I think your question is the point going to come where they lose control of it? And the answer is, my opinion is no, because they've already passed that point.
Oh, okay.
I think they already recognize that this process has gone so far that there's no way that they can continue to control it. Mm-hmm. It's going to blow up. It's under great signs of stress, of course. It's right. The fact that it has the appearance of still holding together is a miracle, and so forth. So I think their decision, probably finalized a couple of years ago, was to accelerate the destructive components of it so rapidly so that it would blow up under their direction, so they can time it. And so, but it would be part of a strategy to bring about another system that is even worse, to replace it.
Sure.
So that I think their strategy was to destroy the existing monetary system and say, "Oh, this is terrible. How could this have possibly?" Those politicians just kept spending money, and so
point the blame. The blame.
Yeah, we got to do something about this. But we have a new system. It's called digital currency. It's digital. It's crypto, and you can't create it. It's wonderful, and we'll get the politicians out of it. We'll have the central banks run it, and now we're dependable and so forth. And I think the goal of a cashless society. It's not, I know. The goal of a cashless society has been on their agenda for a long, long time.
Sure. It's the ultimate.
Probably at least a century.
Yeah.
And by a cashless society, let's define what that means. I'm not talking about not having dollar bills in your pocket or something like that. I'm talking about any tangible asset that you could use as a medium of exchange. That would be dollar bills, coins, and so forth. And digital currency is the ideal solution for that and for them.
Yeah.
Because especially, now I'm not talking about credit card money. That's digital money, of course.
Right.
But at least you can exchange it for coins or something of tangible value, coins or anything. A warehouse full of cheap white wine or something.
Right.
It's an asset. But what they want to morph into and are morphing into is what they call a central bank digital currency. Mm-hmm. But now they decided to condemn that, to popularize their wholesomeness, I guess. That no, we're not going to have a centralized digital currency. We're going to outlaw that. But then, if you read the really small print at the bottom of the page, it says, however, we're going to put out something that's the same as that, but we won't call it that.
Right. Yeah. They're masters at calling things different things. Like that's, quantitative easing. Like, they come up with this terminology or
why don't they just say money making?
Yeah, exactly.
Money printing.
When we started having the bout of price inflation after the pandemic, it was it's transitory. It's interesting. But no, I can see exactly what you're saying, and for a person who wants to control things, and obviously that's in the genetic makeup of most politicians and central bankers, digital currency is a dream come true. You can totally control people. You can control what they spend. You can control, how much they have. You can turn off their money.
That's the thing. That's the element right there. It's the programmable money.
Yeah.
Now, no matter what they come up with, if we're talking about the same guys that are running the show today, the same elitists that are running the show behind the scenes, whatever they come up with, it's not going to challenge their control over the population through money. It's going to enhance it. And the only enhancement left is to make it programmable so that they can throw a switch and you ain't got nothing.
Yeah.
Because your account suddenly is empty or blocked or whatever.
Blocked, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said the wrong thing or
voted for the wrong
guy.
person.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's we'll keep our eyes open, but that's a very good insight. So, are you currently working on any projects now? I know you're still active out there. Obviously, you're talking to me.
Well, I'm very active. I wish I could be more active. Wish I had more hours in the day. I'm in the background, I'm still trying to finish my next book. But in the meantime, in the foreground, I'm doing everything I can to bring our next Red Pill Expo to the stage, which is scheduled to be held on July 12 and 13 in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Okay. And
I would urge anybody that wants to really get hold of the voltage wires, and see how much voltage is. And to meet people who are active in this field and exchange ideas, they should come physically to the Red Pill Expo in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, it is going to be available online for free, so we want everybody in the world to get this information. But if you really want to get involved in doing something about it, you've got to hook up with other people. You've got to start to build a movement, an organization. So that's why we really encourage people to come to the physical meeting. And so you'll find that online at redpillexpo.org.
Fantastic.
Just as a little background, that is kind of a funnel, you might call it, as an introduction to the Red Pill University, which is sort of behind that. And that's a 24/7 thing. It's online, and you can go to redpilluniversity.org. And it's sort of like Red Pill Expo, only on steroids, and it's all the time, night and day, every day. And if you want to dig deeply all the way to the hardcore center, that conspiratorial center, there's no conspiracy at all. It's out in the open.
Right.
And behind it all is Freedom Force International, which is an organization I created in 2002. That's sort of like the think tank behind the whole thing. And I think we're pretty well organized. All we need now is to bring together the people like yourself and so many hundreds of thousands of other people, millions of people, who really do know what's going on or are a pretty good idea and who want to do something about it. Because just knowing about it is, what's that good? That's of no value.
Right.
Well, we have to knock these people off their purchase, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And replace them with good, honest people who have no axe to grind except liberty.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking a little time out of your day to talk to me. You are a blessing. Your work is so important. And, when I first started kind of getting involved in the quote unquote liberty movement, that your book was one of the first things people started talking about. You got to understand what's going on with the Fed. So you've already created a wonderful legacy, and it's so exciting that you're still out there and still doing everything you can to make the world a better place. So very much appreciated. And again, really means a lot that you took the time to hang out with me for a little bit today.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's my pleasure. And congratulations to you and appreciation to you for your helping to spread the word.
Well, thank you.
Really appreciate that.
All right. Well, you have a good evening, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
What an amazing treat to have Mr. Griffin on the show. We were incredibly honored that he was willing to talk to us, and I hope you enjoyed that fascinating interview just as much as I did. Hard to believe G. Edward is 93 years old. We should all aspire to sound so good and so sharp and be accomplishing such great things as he is at 93 if we're fortunate enough to reach that age ourselves one day. Well, that will do it for this week. Be sure to check back next Friday for our next weekly Market Wrap podcast and catch our midweek podcast as well, hosted by Mike Meharry and appropriately dubbed the Money Metals Midweek Memo. To find any of our audio programs, just go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other popular podcast platforms, or simply by going to moneymetals.com/podcast. Until next time, this has been Mike Gleason with Money Metals Exchange. Thanks for listening, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this week's Money Metals podcast. Be sure to come back next week. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast through iTunes. For answers to all of your questions, or to discreetly and securely buy or sell gold or silver coins, bars, and rounds, call 1-800-800-1865 or visit www.moneymetals.com. Our knowledgeable and no-pressure specialists are standing by to answer your call during business hours, Monday through Saturday. Or you can lock in your order online, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, visit us at www.moneymetals.com or call 1-800-800-1865.